The gunshot that killed Elias McKinley a year ago had been loud, but the silence that followed was deafening. Sarah McKinley, a widow at 24, knew the sound of loneliness better than her own name. Her homestead, a tiny scar on the vast, unforgiving skin of the Wyoming Territory, was her fortress and her prison. She thought she had prepared for every danger this land could offer. The blizzards, the drought, the wolves. She was wrong. The real danger wasn't in the howl of the wind. It was in the cry of a child. The wind on the high plains of Wyoming didn't just blow, it mourned. It was a constant, keening sound that scraped at the rough-hewn boards of Sarah McKinley's cabin and, more often than not, at the raw edges of her nerves. It was the only voice she heard most days. It had been 387 days since she had heard her husband's. Elias. His name felt like a small, smooth stone she kept in her pocket, worn down by constant, secret touching. Elias had built this cabin with his own hands, broad and calloused. He had pointed to the endless sea of grama grass and sagebrush and called it future. He saw a herd, a family, a legacy. Sarah had tried to see it too, but now all she saw was the crushing weight of the sky and a horizon that promised nothing but more of itself. The future had died with him, kicked to death by a spooked mule while he was plowing the stubborn earth. Now, her life was a rhythm of survival, a checklist of chores that began before the sun and ended long after it had bled out behind the western ridges. She mended the fences, chopped the wood, tended the small, withered garden, and checked her traps. She was gaunt, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had once been soft. Her hands, which Elias used to praise for their piano-playing delicacy, were now chapped, scarred, and strong. This afternoon, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly greenish purple that promised violence. The air had gone heavy and still, a held breath before a scream. A storm was coming. Not just a squall, but one of the monsters that scoured the plains, wiping the slate clean. Sarah moved with practiced urgency. She latched the heavy shutter over the single glass window, plunging the one-room cabin into a dim, amber twilight. She checked the seal around the door, stuffing rags into the cracks Elias hadn't had time to finish chinking. She secured the nervous chickens in their small, reinforced coop, threw extra hay to the single mule in the lean-to, and brought in enough firewood to last, she prayed, through the night. The first crack of thunder was not a rumble, but a percussive boom that shook the tin cup on her table. Then the rain came, not as drops, but as a solid, roaring sheet of water that turned the world outside into a grey, churning chaos. The wind howled, a symphony of furies. Sarah sat on the small stool, her back against the cold stone of the fireplace, a shotgun resting across her lap. This was her ritual. The gun wasn't for the storm, but for what the storm might disguise. Wolves, perhaps, or men, who could be worse. Hours passed. The cabin was an ark in a drowning world. The relentless noise was hypnotic, a physical weight pressing against her. She must have dozed, her chin dropping to her chest, the gun heavy on her knees. She was jolted awake not by a sound, but by a change in the sound. The wind's constant howl had dipped, and in that brief trough she heard it. It was thin, faint, and utterly impossible. A cry. Not the yip of a coyote or the scream of a cougar. It was the reedy, desperate wail of a human baby. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat, a painful, frantic bird. She froze, convinced the silence and the grief were finally making her mad. Elias had been gone for over a year. Their own child, little Thomas, had lasted only 6 months, taken by a croup 2 winters ago. The cabin was a place of ghosts. Perhaps they were finally speaking. The wind roared again, obliterating the world. But Sarah remained rigid, straining her ears. The storm crested, a wave of noise and fury, and then, in the next lull, it came again. Wah! It was closer. It was real. Her first instinct was terror. Nothing good was out in this. No sane woman would be. This was a trap, a lure. The stories the settlers in town, 10 miles away, told were full of such things. Raiding parties, deceptions. But the sound. It was the sound of her own son's last, gasping breaths. It was a sound that bypassed reason and struck directly at the core of her, the hollowed-out place where motherhood had briefly lived. She grabbed her oilskin slicker, the one that still smelled faintly of Elias's pipe tobacco. She checked the load in her shotgun, thrust her feet into her husband's oversized boots, and unbolted the door. The wind ripped the door from her hand, slamming it back against the cabin wall with a crack. The rain was horizontal, like tiny frozen needles. It was instant, blinding darkness, a maelstrom of noise and water. "Hello!" she screamed, her voice stolen from her lungs and shredded by the wind. "Who's there?" Only the storm answered. She pulled the door closed, leaving it open just a crack, and peered out. Nothing. Just the roaring dark. Then she saw it, or thought she did. A flicker of movement near the washout, a gully that cut through the north side of her property. It was maybe 50 yards away. The cry came again, sharper this time, a spike of pure, unadulterated misery. "God help me," Sarah whispered. She pushed the door open, lowered her head against the gale, and stepped out into the night. The mud was a living thing. It sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down, to claim her as part of the deluge. Every step was a battle. The wind tore at her slicker, the rain finding the gaps at her neck and wrists, chilling her to the bone in seconds. The world was a chaotic, tactile assault of cold, wet, and noise. She held the shotgun in one hand, pointed toward the ground, the barrel filling with rain. It was useless now, but letting it go felt like surrendering her last defense. She stumbled, falling to one knee, the thick, alkaline mud soaking her trousers. She cursed, a raw, unfeminine sound that was immediately swallowed by the storm. "Where?" she yelled into the void. "Where are you?" She aimed for the dark line of the washout. It was deeper now, the storm turning it into a raging, muddy torrent. She slipped on the bank, sliding down into the gush of water, which was already knee-high and pulling at her with surprising strength. And that's when she saw it. Tangled in the roots of an old, half-uprooted cottonwood, snagged just before the current could claim it, was a bundle. It was a cradle board. Her blood ran colder than the rain. This was not a settler's child. She waded through the pulling water, her heart a drum against her ribs. The cradleboard was made of dark, oiled wood, intricately beaded in a pattern she didn't recognize. It was partially submerged, the baby itself shielded only by a small, curved piece of wicker and a thick buffalo hide wrap. She reached it, her fingers clumsy and numb. She grabbed the edge and pulled. It was heavy, logged with water. The cry had stopped. A new, sharper fear lanced through her. I'm too late. She dragged the cradleboard up the muddy bank, collapsing onto the flat ground as the wind tried to peel her from the earth. She fumbled with the wet leather ties, her hands shaking so violently she could barely make a fist. The baby was strapped in tightly. She ripped the hide wrap away. Inside, a small face, the color of wet copper, was streaked with mud and tears. Its eyes were closed, its small, perfect mouth open in a silent woe. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than a few months old. He was terribly still. Sarah pressed 2 frozen fingers against his neck. Nothing. She pressed her ear to his chest, shielding him with her body. A faint, stuttering beat. A shallow, hitching breath. He was alive, but just. He was burning with fever. Even in the freezing rain, she could feel the unnatural heat radiating from his skin. "Oh, God! Oh, Thomas!" she breathed, the name of her own lost son escaping her lips like a prayer. She stood up, her body acting with a purpose her mind hadn't yet agreed to. She couldn't carry the waterlogged cradleboard and the shotgun and climb the bank. She let the gun fall. It vanished into the mud with a soft thunk. She hefted the cradleboard, clutching it to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. It probably was. She turned her back to the wind and began the agonizing climb back to the cabin. Each step was a negotiation with the mud. The wind was a physical enemy, pushing against her, trying to knock her off balance. She was fighting for her own life and for the life of this tiny, unknown child. Who was he? Where had he come from? The nearest Comanche winter camps were said to be over the Wind River Range, 100 miles or more. They never came this far south in this season, not unless they were desperate or fleeing. She reached the cabin door, her shoulder aching, her lungs burning. She kicked the door open and fell inside, landing on the rough-hewn floorboards in a puddle of mud and rainwater. She lay there for a long moment, the roar of the storm outside muffled, the silence of the cabin absolute. All she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the faint, terrible hitch of the baby's. She crawled to the door and forced it shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The thud of the bar was a sound of finality. She had just locked the world out. Or, she thought, looking at the bundle on her floor, she had just locked it in. She lit a lantern. The small, smoky flame cast wild, dancing shadows. She worked the leather straps, her fingers more nimble now in the relative warmth. She gently, so gently, lifted the baby from the board. He was dressed in a tiny, finely beaded buckskin shirt. His black hair was plastered to his scalp. When she moved him, he let out a tiny, pained whimper. His skin was fire. Sarah's mind, which had been frozen with shock, suddenly clicked into a sharp, clear focus. The shock was gone, replaced by a fierce, practical energy she hadn't felt since Elias died. This was not a Comanche baby. This was not a white baby. This was a sick baby. She stripped off his wet clothes and her own slicker, throwing them into a heap by the door. She wrapped him in her own son's flannel receiving blanket, the one she had kept in the bottom of her chest. The faint smell of cedar and lavender rose from the fabric. She stoked the fire, the small embers catching, casting a warm, orange glow. She set a kettle of water to boil. She fetched the small box from under her bed. It contained her meager medical supplies, dried yarrow for fevers, willow bark, bandages, and a small bottle of laudanum. She sat in the rocking chair, the one Elias had built for her, and began to rock the child. He was light, far too light. "All right, little one," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "You're a long way from home, but you're not going to die tonight. I won't let you." The storm raged. The cabin was a single point of light and warmth in a world of howling chaos, and inside, a woman who had lost everything was holding a child who had no one. The longest night of Sarah McKinley's life had only just begun. The cabin became a crucible. The battle for the child's life was fought in the flickering shadows cast by the single lantern. Outside, the storm shrieked, a soundtrack of pure, elemental fury. Inside, there was only the sound of the crackling fire, the drip, drip of water from Sarah's still wet hair, and the shallow, rasping breath of the baby. Sarah worked with a desperate, focused intensity. She mashed the dried yarrow and willow bark into a paste, thinning it with hot water to create a bitter, steaming tea. She knew the Comanche would have their own remedies, powerful plants she couldn't name. All she had was the folk knowledge her grandmother had taught her, a blend of settler practicality and old-world herbalism. The first challenge was getting the baby to drink. He was listless, his eyes squeezed shut, his tiny body rigid with fever. She dipped the corner of a clean rag into the cool tea and squeezed the drops into his mouth. He choked, a small, weak sound that tore at her heart, but some of it went down. She did it again, and again. An hour passed, measured in drops of bitter tea. She filled a basin with cool water from the rain barrel, thankfully full now, and began to bathe him. She laid him on her bed, on Elias's side, and gently sponged his burning skin. His body was perfectly formed, his limbs delicate. Around his neck was a small leather thong, and on it a single polished bear claw, a talisman, a prayer. As she worked, the rigid categories of her world began to dissolve. The fear of Comanche, the warnings from Deacon Miller in the settlement. The only good one is a dead one, he'd preached. All of it felt distant, absurd. This was not an enemy. This was not a savage. This was a child, smaller and more fragile than her own lost Thomas. The memory of Thomas hit her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered his own fever, the way his breath had turned into a barking, hollow cough. She remembered sitting by his cradle, just like this, bathing him, praying, making promises to a God who didn't seem to be listening. She had failed her son. The thought came, cold and sharp. I will not fail this one. The fever was a stubborn, clinging thing. The child would cool for a moment under her touch, his breathing easing, only to be racked by a tremor as the heat surged back, his skin drying instantly. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his people. She didn't know if his mother was out there, dead in the storm, or if his father was part of a war party. It didn't matter. You're a fighter, aren't you? She murmured, wiping his face. You held on in that storm. You held on for me to find you. You just have to hold on a little longer. She sat in the rocker, the baby cradled against her chest, her own body heat a living poultice. She rocked, the rhythmic creak-creak of the wooden runners on the floor a counterpoint to the wind. She sang to him, the only songs she knew, old, sad lullabies from the Appalachian hills where she was born. Her voice was cracked and quiet, but it was a human sound, and it seemed to calm him. His small, clenched fists uncurled, hours melted, the fire burned down to coals. Sarah added more wood. The lantern burned low. She refilled the oil. The storm's initial fury subsided, settling into a deep, groaning wind and a relentless, driving rain. The cabin grew cold. Sarah shivered, pulling Elias's heavy wool blanket around herself and the child. The baby's breathing was changing. It was no longer the shallow, hitching gasp. It was becoming slower, deeper, and punctuated by a terrifying, rattling wheeze. Pneumonia, the water, the cold. Her heart sank. She had seen this before. In the settlement, it was called the winter killer. For a child this small, it was a death sentence. Desperation made her bold. She remembered one last, old remedy, one she had been too afraid to try on Thomas, a whiskey and onion poultice. She laid the baby down and went to the chest. At the very bottom, under Elias's Sunday suit, was a bottle of whiskey. He had been saving it to celebrate the day their first crops came in. It was still full. She grabbed one of her few remaining onions, chopped it coarsely, and mixed it with a heavy splash of whiskey in a small pan. She heated it over the fire until the fumes were so strong they made her eyes water. She wrapped the hot, steaming mash in a piece of flannel. She unwrapped the baby, his skin now frighteningly pale under the copper tone. She placed the hot, pungent poultice on his tiny chest. He screamed. It was not a whimper. It was a full-throated, furious, living scream. The sound was so shocking, so vibrant, that Sarah burst into tears. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The baby wailed, kicking his legs, outraged by the stinging heat and the overwhelming smell. "Yes," Sarah sobbed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, you fight me, that's it. Be angry. Be alive." She held him, rocking him, whispering apologies and encouragements. The scream softened back into a cry, and then, as the poultice's heat began to soothe the congestion, the cry faded into a weak but steady breath. The rattling wheeze was still there, but it sounded looser, as if the fire on his chest was breaking up the ice within it. She held him for what remained of the night. She did not sleep. She watched the shadows on the wall lengthen, and then, finally, begin to reach. She didn't sleep. She watched the shadows on the wall lengthen, and then, finally, begin to retreat. The black square of the shuttered window turned a pale, sickly grey. The wind had died. The rain had stopped. The silence that fell over the cabin was profound, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves, and the sound of the baby's breathing. It was soft, but it was regular. Sarah touched his forehead. The fire was gone. He was still warm, but it was the warmth of a living, sleeping child, not the dry, scorching heat of fever. His skin was damp with a clean, healthy sweat. She sagged against the back of the rocker, an exhaustion so complete it was almost painful. She had done it. She had pulled him back. She looked down at the child sleeping in her arms. His face, in the peaceful repose of sleep, was beautiful. His long lashes rested on his cheeks. She felt a surge of, not just victory, but possession. My baby. My boy. She had been a widow. She had been a bereaved mother. Now, in the space of one night, she was something else entirely. She was a protector. As the first, clean rays of the new day's sun found the cracks in the cabin walls, Sarah McKinley finally allowed her own eyes to close. She drifted into a shallow, dreamless sleep. The baby held fast to her heart, the rocking chair slowly, finally, coming to a stop. Sarah woke with a jolt, a gasp of disorientation. The cabin was filled with the strange, flat light of a post-storm morning. For a heartbeat, she didn't know what had woken her. It was the silence. The cabin was too quiet. Her eyes flew to the bundle in her arms. The baby was gone. A raw, animalistic panic seized her. She leaped from the rocking chair, her stiff limbs screaming in protest. "No!" She spun around. The baby was not gone. She had, in her exhausted stupor, laid him on her bed, swaddled in the dry flannel. He was awake, his dark, intelligent eyes open and staring at the ceiling. He was perfectly, miraculously quiet. Sarah's heart, which had tried to escape her chest, settled back into a rapid, painful rhythm. She put a hand to her mouth, her knuckles white. "You scared me," she whispered, her voice a croak. She walked to the bed, her legs unsteady. The baby turned his head, his black eyes fixing on her. There was no fear in them, only a deep, unnerving curiosity. She touched his cheek. He was cool. The fever was gone. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. She laughed, a small, shaky sound. "Well, little one, we made it." The cabin was a wreck. Mud was caked on the floor from her entrance. Wet clothes were in a heap. The basin, the whiskey bottle, the remnants of the onion poultice. It looked like a field hospital. But the air, which had been thick with the smell of sickness and fear, now smelled of onion, whiskey, and wet wood. It smelled of survival. Sarah felt a sudden, desperate need to see the sun. She needed to know the world was still there. She walked to the window and unlatched the heavy shutter. She pushed it open, squinting against the sudden, brilliant flood of light. The world was scoured clean. The sky was an impossible, aching blue. The ground was a sea of mud. But the air was so clear it seemed to magnify the distant mountains. She took a deep, cleansing breath, and then she froze. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat like a dry thistle. Through the imperfect, wavy glass of the window, past the water droplets clinging to the pane, a shape resolved itself against the grey light of dawn. He was about 100 yards out, near the line of cottonwoods where her property ended. A man. No, not just a man. He was mounted on a sow, the horse's breath pluming in the cold. He was still as a granite tore, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. A rifle was cradled in his arm, and a single stark black feather was tied in his long hair. He wasn't a settler. He wasn't a soldier from the fort. He was Comanche. Sarah's hand flew to the door, checking the bar. It was still in place. Her heart, which had just calmed, began a new, frantic hammering. This was not the thrum of fear. It was the pounding of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. He wasn't charging. He wasn't making threats. He wasn't, in fact, doing anything at all. He just sat there, his horse occasionally shifting a hoof, his own gaze fixed unerringly on her cabin. He was watching. He must have been there for hours. He must have been there when the storm broke. Had he seen her bring the baby in? Was he the father? Was this a trap? Her mind raced, a frantic rabbit caught in a snare. The baby. He must be here for the baby. She looked at the child, sleeping so peacefully on her bed. A fierce, primal wave of possession, the same one she'd felt last night, surged through her. No, I saved him. He's mine. The thought was insane. She knew it was insane. This was his father, or his uncle. This was his people. But she had saved him. She had sat through the night. She had fought the fever. She had used her dead son's blanket. A bond had been forged in that feverish crucible, a bond she wasn't ready to break. She backed away from the window, her body moving with a strange, jerky stiffness. She was a prisoner in her own home. She went to the hearth, her mind racing. What did he want? If he wanted to attack, he would have. A lone warrior, even one, was more than a match for a woman with a mud-filled shotgun. He was waiting. But for what? For her to bring the baby out? To surrender? An hour passed. Sarah made coffee, her hands shaking so much she spilled the grounds. She drank the scalding liquid, her eyes never leaving the window. He did not move. The sun climbed higher. The warrior became a statue, a permanent, terrifying fixture in her new landscape. His stillness was more frightening than any war cry. It was a statement of infinite patience, a statement of intent. The baby woke and began to fussy, a small, hungry cry. Sarah's body, which had not nursed a child in 2 years, ached with a phantom memory, but her mind was practical. She had no milk. She heated water and mixed it with a little of her precious sugar and a dash of canned milk from the larder. It was a poor substitute, but it was all she had. She fed the baby with a small spoon, her back to the window. She couldn't bear to look at the warrior, but she could feel his gaze. It was a physical pressure on the cabin, on her skin. She had to do something. She couldn't stay in here forever. She changed the baby, cleaning him as best she could. She found the cradle board, which she had left by the door. It was drying, but the intricate beadwork was caked with mud. She began to clean it, her hands moving automatically. The workmanship was beautiful. Tiny beads, the color of sky and blood woven into a complex, geometric pattern. This was not a quick, functional item. This was a work of love. This was a mother's gift. This child was wanted. This child was loved. The realization hit her. The warrior wasn't a threat. He was a sentinel. He wasn't guarding against her. He was guarding her. She looked out the window again. The light was different now, the sun higher. She could see his face more clearly. It was a strong, hard face, etched with lines of grief and exhaustion. His eyes were fixed on her door. He was waiting to see if the child had survived the night. He was guarding the cabin, protecting the one person who was protecting his son. A new emotion, one she couldn't name, displaced the fear. It was a complex, aching thing, a mix of pity, of respect, and a strange, shared understanding. He was a parent, just as she was. He was just as desperate as she had been. The standoff continued. The sun reached its zenith. The man and his horse remained, a testament of unwavering, silent vigil. Sarah McKinley, a widow on the Wyoming prairie, and a Comanche warrior 100 yards distant, were locked in a strange, unspoken truce, bound together by the small, sleeping child who lay between them. The day wore on, measured by the slow, westward crawl of the warrior's shadow. The silence was absolute, heavier and more profound than the storm's fury. Inside the cabin, Sarah fed the baby more sugared milk. The child, whom she had started to call Little Wolf in her head for the bare claw around his neck, was growing stronger. His eyes were alert, and he watched her with a solemn, ancient gaze. Every time she moved to the window, the warrior was there. He had not eaten, nor drunk, nor moved from his post. His horse stood, head bowed, just as patient as its master. Sarah felt a strange kinship with this man. They were both trapped, both waiting for... What? She knew this couldn't last. The world would intrude. She just hadn't expected it to intrude so soon. Around 3 in the afternoon, a new sound broke the stillness. Not the soft pad of a moccasin or the rustle of the wind, but the hard, rhythmic thud of shod horses, and voices, loud, booming, English voices. Sarah's blood ran cold, a new and different fear. She rushed to the window. 2 riders were approaching from the south, from the direction of the settlement. She recognized them instantly, and her stomach clenched. Deacon Miller and his son, Jeb. Deacon Miller was the self-appointed moral authority of the tiny, wind-swept settlement. He was a large man, his girth straining a black broadcloth suit he wore in all weather. He carried a Bible in his saddlebag and a .45 caliber Righteousness on his hip. His son, Jeb, was a slouching, mean-eyed echo of his father, all brawn and low cunning. They were, ostensibly, checking on the widow McKinley after the storm. Sarah knew their real purpose. Miller had been trying to buy her homestead since Elias died, claiming the land was too much for a lone woman to handle. He wanted her water rights. Oh no, she breathed. This was a complication she could not afford. She looked frantically toward the warrior. He had seen them. He sat up straighter, his hand moving to the rifle in his lap. He did not retreat. He did not hide. He simply watched the new arrivals. "Deacon Miller!" Sarah called, forcing her voice to be steady as she stepped out onto the small porch. She did not open the door wide, just enough to slip out, pulling it almost shut behind her. She had to keep them out here. A terrible storm. "Sister Sarah," Miller boomed, pulling his horse to a stop. His eyes, small and shrewd, took in the mud-caked hem of her dress, the exhaustion on her face. "We came to see if the Lord had seen fit to spare you. The creeks washed out the lower road." "We're fine, Deacon. The cabin is strong. Sarah said, her hands twisting in her apron. Jeb, meanwhile, wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the warrior in the distance. He nudged his father, his voice a low, excited growl. "Pa! Look! Comanche!" Miller's head snapped around. His face, which had been arranged in lines of pious concern, hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Jeb, your rifle," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "We've got a heathen trespasser." "No." Sarah's voice was sharp, shocking both men. He's not doing anything. He's just sitting there." Miller turned his piggy eyes on her. The mask of the kind deacon was gone, revealing the bully beneath. "Not doing anything? A Comanche warrior on a rise overlooking a white woman's cabin? He's sizing you up, girl. Sizing up your defenses. Probably part of a whole war party, waiting for the rest." "He's been there all morning," Sarah said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "He's just watching. I think he's guarding me." She couldn't say it. It sounded insane. "He's what, Sarah?" Jeb taunted, his rifle now resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. "He's your new friend." "He's just one man," Sarah pleaded. "He's probably lost." "He'll be lost permanently in a minute," Jeb said, starting to raise his rifle. "Hold, Jebediah," Miller commanded. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He walked toward Sarah, his bulk imposing. "Sister, you seem overwrought. The storm has shaken you. We will handle this filth. Now you go inside, and we'll take care of your little Indian problem." He put his hand on her porch rail, intending to come up. "No," Sarah said, her voice low. She didn't move from the doorway. "This is my land, Deacon, and I say he's not a threat." Miller stopped. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw the defiance, the steel in her spine that hadn't been there a week ago, and his suspicion, always simmering, boiled over. "What are you hiding, woman?" he hissed. "What's in that cabin? You in league with them? Trading? Or worse?" He shoved his way past her, his shoulder knocking her hard against the doorframe. "Jeb, check the cabin. Make sure she ain't harboring vipers." "Get out!" Sarah shrieked, grabbing his arm. "You have no right!" Miller flung her off, sending her stumbling back into the cabin. "I have God's right, harlot. God's right to cleanse this land." And at that exact moment, from the bed in the corner, the baby let out a high, thin wail. The cabin went utterly silent. Even Jeb, who was halfway through the door, froze. Miller's head turned slowly, like a predator scenting blood. He stared at the corner of the room, where the flannel-wrapped bundle was now wriggling. "What is that?" he whispered, his face a mottled, furious red. Jeb moved first. He strode to the bed and tore the blanket back. He looked at the copper-skinned child, at the black tuft of hair, at the small bare claw around his neck. Jeb looked back at his father, his face a mask of disgusted triumph. "Well, I'll be. She's got one. A papoose. The widow's gone breed. Treachery," Miller breathed, his eyes wide with a fanatic's zeal. "Abomination. You bring this filth into a Christian home." "He was sick," Sarah cried, scrambling to her feet, placing herself between the men and the bed. "He was dying in the storm. He's just a baby." "It's a snake," Miller spat. "And you don't save a snake. You crush its head before it can bite." He looked at Jeb. "Take it. We'll dump it back in the gully where it belongs." "No!" Sarah screamed, and she lunged, not at Miller, but at the wall, where Elias's other gun, his hunting rifle, was mounted over the fireplace. She was fast, but Jeb was faster. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back so hard her head snapped, and threw her to the floor. "You touch that gun, you little traitor, and I'll break your arm," he snarled, raising his boot. "Enough, Jebediah," Miller said, his voice calm again. He was in control. He walked over to the bed and looked down at the baby, who was now crying in earnest. "We will purify this house. We'll start with this." He reached down to grab the child. "He is my son." The voice was not Miller's. It was not Jeb's. It was not Sarah's. It was deep, guttural, and thick with an accent. All three white people froze. Miller turned, his face pale. Standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, was the warrior. His rifle was gone, left with his horse. In his hand was a long, heavy-bladed knife. He was gaunt, his face hollowed by sickness and grief, but his eyes were burning with a fire that eclipsed the sun. He had seen the shove, he had heard the scream, and he had come. He took one more step into the cabin, his gaze locked on Deacon Miller. "You touch my son, you die." The air in the cabin was so thick with tension it was unbreathable. 4 people, a baby, and a chasm of hatred and fear dividing them. Jeb, his face ashen, still had his rifle, but it was pointed at the floor. He was frozen, his back to the warrior. Deacon Miller, to his credit, was not a complete coward. He was a bully, but he was a zealot, and he believed he was right. He slowly, deliberately, let his hand drop to the .45 on his hip. "Get out of this house, savage," Miller hissed. "This is a white man's house, a house of God." The warrior's eyes, black as obsidian, didn't waver. He was weak. Sarah could see it now. He was trembling, not from fear, but from the same fever that had almost claimed his son. He was holding himself upright by sheer, desperate will. He was dying on his feet. "He is my son," the warrior repeated, his voice a hoarse rasp. He gestured, his chin toward the baby. "Tavsena. Little wolf." "It's an it," Jeb snarled, finally finding his voice and his courage. He started to turn, bringing his rifle up. "And you're a dead man." "No," Sarah shrieked. She didn't think. She acted. She launched herself from the floor, not at Jeb, but at the bed. She snatched the baby from the mattress, pulling him to her chest in a single, fluid motion. She spun around and stood directly between Jeb's rising rifle and the Comanche warrior at the door. "Stop!" she screamed. The force of her voice shocked them all into a momentary pause. The baby, pressed against her, was wailing. "Sarah, get out of the way!" Miller roared. "That's a heathen. He's come to kill you." "He's come for his son!" Sarah cried, her voice cracking with tears and fury. "And you!" She stabbed a finger at Miller. "You came to murder a child." "That is not a child. That is a plague," Miller yelled, his face purple. "It is the seed of Satan. Give it to me." "His name," Sarah said, her voice dropping, trembling but fierce, "is Tavsena, and his father is standing right there. You will not have him." The warrior, who Sarah now saw was named Black Hawk, stared at her. His hard, impassive face cracked. He looked at this white woman, this enemy, who had saved his son, who was now standing, shield-like, in front of him, protecting him from his own people. Confusion, and then a profound, aching understanding passed through his eyes. "Jeb," Miller said, his voice flat and cold, "shoot the man." Jeb licked his lips. He was a bully, not a killer. Not a face-to-face killer. He looked at Sarah, at the baby, at the warrior. He looked at his father. "Pa, she's in the way," he stammered. "Then shoot through her," Miller commanded. "She's already dead to the Lord, a traitor to her own kind." This was it. The moment the world broke. Sarah looked at Deacon Miller, a man she had once respected, a man who preached the gospel of mercy every Sunday. She saw in his eyes a madness, a hatred so pure it was bottomless. He meant it. Deacon, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Do you remember my Thomas? Your son Jeb helped Elias build the coffin. You preached the funeral. Miller faltered. What? What has that to do with this? This abomination? You said God's will was a mystery, Sarah continued, her voice soft, the baby's cries subsiding into whimpers against her shoulder. You said my boy was an angel, taken too soon. You told me to find comfort in the Lord's mercy. She took a step toward him, away from Black Hawk, shielding the warrior with her back. She was now between the two Miller men. This baby, she said, was dying. His mother, I don't know where she is, probably dead in the storm. This man, his father, was sick, watching his own son die. I think he left him here. For me. He left him hoping. She looked at Black Hawk over her shoulder. He nodded, a short, sharp gesture. Yes. I saved him, Deacon, she said, her eyes boring into his. The way I couldn't save my own Thomas. And you come into my home, and you want to finish the job the storm couldn't? She held the baby out. Look at him, Deacon. Is this the face of a demon, or is it the face of a child? Miller stared at the baby. He saw the dark skin. He saw the black hair. He saw Comanche. It is a demon, he said, his voice hollow. Then you, Sarah said, pulling the baby back, are a man who would murder a child. And God will not forgive that. I don't care what your Bible says. I will not allow it. The standoff stretched. The silence was absolute, save for the baby's soft snuffing. Jeb looked at his father. He looked at Sarah. He was breathing heavily. This was not the fun excursion he had planned. He slowly, very slowly, lowered the barrel of his rifle. Pa, Jeb said, his voice a low whine. This ain't right. She's just a woman. She's lost her mind from the grief. Let's just go. Miller looked at his son, his face a mask of contempt. Coward. You're weak, just like your mother. He turned back to Sarah. He saw the resolution in her eyes. He saw the warrior at the door, weak but willing to die. And he saw his son, who had lost his nerve. He was a bully, and his pack had deserted him. You have made your bed, Sarah McKinley, he said, his voice dripping with venom. You have chosen the viper over your own. You are no longer white. You are no longer one of us. He pointed a thick finger at her. Do not come to the settlement. Do not ask for supplies. Do not ask for help. As of this moment, you are an outcast. You are shunned. When you starve this winter, or when your friends here decide to scalp you, you will know it was the judgment of a righteous God. He turned, shoving his son toward the door. Get out of my way, savage! He spat at Black Hawk. Black Hawk did not move. He simply stood, filling the doorway. Jeb, Miller ordered. Make him move. Jeb looked at the knife in Black Hawk's hand. He looked at the fanaticism in his father's eyes, and he made his choice. Pa, let's just go. Around him. Jeb grabbed his father's arm and pulled him, forcing him to step off the porch into the mud rather than pass the warrior. Miller, sputtering with impotent rage, allowed himself to be led. They mounted their horses. You will burn for this, Sarah McKinley, Miller roared, his voice a last, desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. You will burn in this life and the next. They wheeled their horses and galloped away, sending showers of mud into the air. Sarah stood in the doorway, shaking so hard she could barely stand. The baby was heavy in her arms. She had won. But she had lost everything. She turned. Black Hawk was still standing in the cabin. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, his strength, held together by nothing but rage and adrenaline, finally gave out. His eyes rolled back in his head. The knife clattered to the floor, and he collapsed, a dead weight, falling forward onto the floor of Sarah McKinley's cabin. The thud of Black Hawk's body hitting the floorboards echoed the final, terrible thud of the bar dropping on Sarah's life. She was, in a single moment, an outcast. But she had no time for that. The baby, Tavsena, was crying from the shock of the encounter. Black Hawk was unconscious, a ragged, whistling breath escaping his lips. He was burning. The fever that had almost taken his son had him firmly in its grip. "One thing at a time, Sarah," she muttered to herself, her voice shaking. She laid the crying baby on the bed. "Hush, little wolf. Hush, I'm here." She stoked the fire, her mind a flurry of practical tasks. She had 2 patients now. She rolled Black Hawk over. He was lighter than he looked, his body gaunt under his buckskin shirt. His face was beaded with sweat, his lips cracked and dry. He was dying. The same sickness. He must have given it to his child, or more likely, they had both caught it from the same tragic source. She couldn't lift him. She dragged Elias's pallet from the corner and rolled the warrior onto it, his head near the warmth of the fire. For the next 2 days, Sarah McKinley's cabin became a strange, impossible infirmary. She ceased to be a white woman, a widow, or an outcast. She was simply a nurse. Her world shrank to the 3 bodies in the one-room cabin. She fed Tavsena the last of her canned milk. He was healthy now, a bright, curious infant who cooed when she cleaned him and gripped her finger with a startling, strong hand. Black Hawk was the true struggle. He was a man, and the fever was deep. He thrashed in his delirium, shouting words in a language she could not understand. They were words of grief, of fear. She heard one name, over and over. Pia, his wife, the baby's mother. Sarah did for him what she had done for his son. She brewed the bitter yarrow tea, forcing it between his cracked lips. She bathed him, an intimacy that would have been shocking under any other circumstance. Here, it was simply a necessity. She saw the old scars, bullet, arrow, knife, that mapped his body. This was a man who had lived a life of constant, brutal warfare. And she saw the new wound, a festering, ugly gash on his side, hidden under his shirt. It was not from the storm, it was a bullet wound. The story clicked into place in her mind. They weren't just fleeing the sickness, they were being hunted. Soldiers, settlers, it didn't matter. His band was gone. His wife was dead. He was wounded, and his son was sick. In his delirium, he mistook her for his wife. He would grab her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Pia," he would whisper. "The boy, is he?" "He's safe," Sarah would say, her voice gentle, sponging his forehead. "Tavsena is safe. Sleep." And he would sleep, his breathing ragged. On the 3rd morning, Sarah woke from a doze in her chair to find him staring at her. His eyes were clear. The fever had broken. He was weak, but he was sane. They looked at each other across the small cabin. The baby gurgled in his sleep on the bed. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. Black Hawk slowly, painfully, pushed himself into a sitting position against the wall. "You," he said, his voice a dry croak. "You saved him." Sarah nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "And you?" He looked at his hands, then at his son. "My wife. Pia. She. Sickness. Gone. My people. All gone. Just him. I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. He shook his head, as if to ward off the pity. He looked around the small, clean cabin. He saw the empty tins. He saw the last of the firewood. He saw, in her eyes, the sacrifice. "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question. Sarah looked at the cradleboard. now clean, leaning against the wall. "I lost a son. To the sickness. 2 winters ago. I couldn't lose another." It was a confession, and it was the truth. It was the only truth that mattered. Black Hawk nodded. He understood this. Grief was a universal language. He struggled to his feet. Sarah moved to help him, but he held up a hand. He would stand on his own. He was a warrior. He walked to the bed and looked down at his son. A look of such profound, agonizing love passed over his face that Sarah had to turn away. He gently touched the boy's cheek. He turned back to her. "We go." "You're not strong enough," Sarah said. "The wound." "We go," he repeated. He gestured to the south where Miller had gone. "We'll come back. More. They will not stop." He was right. Deacon Miller's pride was a dangerous thing. He would not let this stand. "I have no food to give you," Sarah said, her voice small. She was ashamed. Black Hawk walked to the pallet where he had lain. From a small pouch on his belt, one she hadn't searched, he pulled 2 things. The first was a strip of dried jerky, which he began to chew, his jaw working slowly. The second he held out to her. It was a small doeskin pouch, beaded with the same blue and red as the cradleboard. It was heavy. Sarah opened it. It was full of small, glittering, irregular rocks. Gold. Raw alluvial gold. "No," Sarah said, pushing it back. I didn't do it for this." "You saved my blood," he said, pressing the pouch into her hand. "This is dirt you take for the winter you will need." He was right. She was shunned. This dirt was the only thing that would allow her to buy supplies from a trader in a distant town, a town where Miller's poison had not spread. It was her survival. She closed her hand around the pouch. "Thank you." He moved to the cradleboard and, with a practiced, gentle efficiency, swaddled Tavsena and strapped him in. The baby, recognizing his father's touch, did not cry. Black Hawk stood, the cradleboard on his back. He was a father again. He looked at the door, then back at her. He held out his hand, not for a shake, but palm up. Sarah, understanding, placed her own hand in his. His was calloused and hard, hers scarred and chapped. He closed his fingers around hers for a brief moment. A warrior's promise. A protector's thanks. He walked to the door and paused. "You are Wikati. Brave woman." And then he was gone. Sarah watched from the doorway as he retrieved his horse from the lean-to, where he must have hidden it. He mounted, the cradleboard secure on his back, and turned the pinto. He did not look back. He rode north, toward the mountains, toward the lands that were still his, disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape. Sarah McKinley stood on her porch, the gold heavy in her hand, the cabin behind her suddenly, deafeningly silent. It was the same silence she had lived with for a year. But it was different. It was no longer the silence of loss. It was the silence of choice. The frontier wasn't just a line on a map. It was a line in the human heart. Sarah drew hers, Black Hawk drew his, and Deacon Miller drew his. What happened on that dusty patch of land wasn't just a story. It was a testament to the choices that make us human, even when the world around us has gone wild. Sarah was shunned, but she survived. She had the gold, but more than that, she had the memory of her own courage. She had become the Wikati, the brave woman. What would you have done if you were moved by Sarah's impossible choice and the silent vigil of the warrior who watched her? Show your support. Hit that like button. It lets us know you value these stories of the real, complex West. Share this video with someone who appreciates that history is not just about heroes and villains, but about ordinary people facing extraordinary choices. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Tell us in the comments, what do you think happened to Sarah McKinley after the warrior left?